So Doctor Who's Christmas special didn't just introduce a new Doctor or a new companion, it also introduced a brand new running mystery to tide us over until next year's season and during the season as well, and possibly even beyond. The identity of Mrs. Flood, this mysterious new character played by EastEnders star Anita Dobson, the neighbour or one of the neighbours to Ruby Sunday. We met her during the church on Ruby Road and she had a few interactions with Ruby and with the Doctor throughout that story. And then of course we have that mid-credit scene right at the end, that kind of jaw-dropping moments where the credits stop, we cut back to the TARDIS dematerialising, we have that little conversation between Mrs. Flood and the neighbour Abdul, and then she kind of stares into camera, she breaks the fourth wall and goes, "Never seen a TARDIS before?" I think I mentioned during my review of The Church on Ruby Road that I would come back to Mrs. Flood at some point in the review, and I never did. So instead, let's have a whole video devoted to her and to this mystery, speculating about the identity of Mrs. Flood, who she could be, what she could be and what she could mean for the Doctor, for Ruby, for the show. Let's just dive straight into it. So what do we know for sure, for certain, about Mrs. Flood? Well, she's an old lady, she's called Mrs. Flood, she lives in London, in Notting Hill, and she appears to have seen a TARDIS before the events of the church on Ruby Road. Now, it's a tad confusing because earlier in the story, before we have the moment at the end, she does appear to kind of not know what the TARDIS is or recognise the TARDIS for what it is. There's that line I think she says to Ruby or someone about having never seen a police box on the streets of London in, 50, 60 years or something. But I think, to be honest with that, it's either more a case of that being part of the facade, part of this innocent old lady facade, which presumably is what it is. She certainly appears to be more than that beneath the surface. It's either that, or maybe the fact that, okay, she has seen TARDISes before in the past, but not the Doctor's specific TARDIS. So she is aware of TARDISes and what they are, but she hasn't actually seen a TARDIS that looks like a police box, hence the surprise. And then, of course, when it disappears, she realises what it is, she realises maybe who the Doctor is, that he's a Time Lord, etc. Yeah, that's kind of what I'd take from it. Either one of those options, which, again, sort of opens it up slightly, because if it was, for instance, the latter option, it would suggest a brand new character who has never interacted with the Doctor before, possibly isn't even aware of the Doctor or what his TARDIS looks like, which, yeah, I suppose it is less likely. I think it's probably more likely that it was the first option, and that was part of the act, and then actually this is a character, who maybe isn't established already in the Whoniverse, but is someone who is aware of the Doctor, is following them, knows, what she's doing and what is going on, is possibly pulling the strings behind events. Is this the boss mentioned by the Meep way back in the Star Beast? Is this the one who waits, mentioned by the Toymaker in the Giggle? She certainly appears to do a lot of waiting around, sitting there with her blanket and her coat on a little chair and her flask of coffee or whiskey or whatever it was, and just watching things and keeping vigil outside of her flat, on the street, talking to neighbours and watching the TARDIS come and go, watching Ruby and the Doctor come and go. She's always there, just, watching it in the background. So that would be a pretty apt description, to be honest, the one who waits. So who is Mrs. Flood? Well, I think, first of all, let's deal with, previous characters from the Whoniverse that she could be. I think it would be amiss of me to not, first of all, mention the possibility that she is the Master. Now, this is one that I actually haven't seen people mention or kind of take seriously all that much, because I think there's a feeling in Doctor Who fandom at the moment that the Master has appeared quite a lot over the past sort of 10 years or so, obviously with Michelle Gomez during the Capaldi era, and then Sacha Dhawan in the Jodie Chibnall era. And so I think there's a feeling, with fans that the character needs a bit of a rest for a few years in order for them to kind of return with any impact and it not just be like business as usual. Now, Russell has already slightly sort of surprisingly actually introduced the idea of the Master into this new era. Of course, in the Giggle with the thing with the Toymaker's tooth, where the Master was imprisoned inside the Toymaker's gold tooth, and then at the end of that story, the tooth fell to the ground when the Toymaker was defeated, and someone picked it up. Now, could that someone have been Mrs. Flood? I think that's entirely possible. It would match up like a female hand, presumably, with like the red nail varnish or whatever. So it could have been her. Or maybe through some twist that the tooth actually turned into Mrs. Flood, and Mrs. Flood is a new version of the Master. Now, like I say, I haven't seen anyone particularly taking this seriously as an option, I think for those reasons that I've outlined. Although I think it's one that we shouldn't dismiss. I think it would be a bit weird in terms of the overall lineup of Masters, to have Roger Delgado, Anthony Ainley, Eric Roberts, and the new series ones as well, and then to just cut to Anita Dobson, like a woman who is in her 70s and probably isn't going to be up to like chasing the Doctor down corridors and stuff. It would be a bit weird, but iconic nevertheless, I think, to have, someone with that past in terms of her previous roles and the EastEnders stuff and whatever, someone, of that stature as well. And the idea of having the Master be an old woman, it's not something that you would necessarily think of straight away, but I actually think that's kind of an iconic, inspired, irresistible idea, potentially, to have this renegade Time Lord actually just be this kind of innocent-looking old woman, this nosy old person sitting on a doorstep, watching the world go by, just waiting for the right moment to pounce, being patient. Is perhaps like it could be a similar sort of thing to what we had with Derek Jacobi in the first Russell era, where we had this kind of short-lived Master incarnation that in that case only appeared for one story. Perhaps this could be a Master that only appears for a handful of cameos or whatever throughout next year's season, and then perhaps regenerates into a younger, more mobile actor or whatever, with the best intentions. Someone who can actually sort of run around and do all that kind of stuff. But equally, actually, having the Master stay as Anita Dobson, if there was a way around it where she could be involved and it wouldn't be a role that would be too taxing for her, I think that would be so fun and so funny and just, hilarious, really. A really inspired thing to do. I suppose the implication is definitely that Mrs. Flood is a villain, and so whoever she ends up being, she will be someone that, eventually has some sort of showdown with Ncuti's Doctor. They've met under very innocent sort of circumstances. That moment at the end of the church in Ruby Road where she says, well, you take care, mister, and then he goes off in the TARDIS. I think to look back on that scene once her true identity has been revealed, be it next year or the year after or whenever, we're going to think, my God, that was the first meeting between these characters. But who else could she be? Because maybe it is the first meeting, maybe again it is an old character from the past. Could this be the Rani? People say it every time. I think that's kind of a more prevalent theory than her being the Master at this point, because the Rani has never ever returned, beyond those two stories that she was in the 80s, on screen at least. I have heard there are potentially some rights issues with the character in terms of the writers, Pip and Jane Baker, and who owns the rights and stuff, so I'm not sure how plausible this one is, but people always say it, could it be the Rani? Again, an old woman on her doorstep is not necessarily the first person you think of when you think of a really intelligent sort of Time Lord scientist, but maybe. Another theory that I do quite like is that she's Tactayun from, obviously series 12 and 13, the Doctor's adoptive mother. Now, in all honesty, I don't see this one actually coming to pass, really, because, that was the previous era. It's in the past now. Yes, Russell is picking up on some elements of the Timeless Child sort of storyline, but I don't really see him going back to Tactayun as a character because, just like I say, she was a chibnall thing, and I think he'll want to do his own stuff, really. Although, again, it's kind of an irresistible idea that the Doctor's adoptive mother could be there, right under his nose, on the doorstep, watching the world go by, watching him zoom around in the TARDIS and stuff, and, again, she's just waiting there for the right moment to actually say, well, this is who I am. I did see a theory as well that she could potentially be an older version of our new companion, Ruby Sunday, who, has obviously grown older and returned to her streets to live out the rest of her days and stuff. I mean, I don't really see this one coming true either, particularly because I think this character is quite clearly a villain, which Ruby clearly is not. And although it would be a nice kind of timey-wimey twist to have everything come full circle, and again, to have Ruby's older self there under her nose, giving her advice and sort of spurring her on to join the Doctor in the TARDIS. I do think something else is going on here. I think she's spurring her on for different reasons, sort of self-interested, malevolent reasons, some big master plan that will only reveal itself, in the coming season, or maybe the one after that. So let's finally explore the possibility of Mrs. Flood being a brand new character, which I think is definitely likely, frankly. I think she'll have connections to the show's wider mythology in the sense that, she is perhaps like a Time Lord or some celestial being, maybe one of this pantheon of gods that the Toymaker was talking about, maybe the one who waits, as I said before, this person or thing or being, whatever, that the Toymaker was too terrified to fight and to go up against and to play games with. Again, I like this idea that this terrifying being could just be in the form or disguise of an old woman there right under our noses on this ordinary Earth street. I like the kind of the juxtaposition at play there. I do like that a lot. So I think, yeah, it will be something along those lines. You know, the boss, the one who waits. I think that would be a nice way to bring those things in, to subvert expectations. Maybe a Time Lord, maybe a god, maybe some other powerful being, you know, but whatever the case, I think she's definitely someone who is there behind the scenes, you know, pulling the strings, manipulating events, you know, from the comfort of her flat, you know, sitting there, doing the crossword and having a cup of tea or something. I just love the idea of this evil mastermind hiding away on Earth as this old woman. And I think whichever way this goes, you know, whoever Mrs. Flood ends up being, as long as it is something along those lines, then I'll be very happy. Those are my thoughts, feelings, theories and predictions about who Mrs. Flood could be. It's still very early days, you know, we've only seen her in one story so far. I'm sure next year, you know, that the kind of speculation will ramp up another notch and there'll be more things to speculate about, more little jaw-dropping moments perhaps of her turning to the camera or saying things, letting things slip. So that's very exciting, you know, going into the new era. But what are your thoughts and theories about who Mrs. Flood could be at this particular stage? You know, do you think she's the Master, the Rani, some other character entirely? Do you think there's something in the name Mrs. Flood that we are all missing? You know, is that a reference to something in particular? I don't know, it wasn't something that I talked about in the video, but perhaps there is something in that. You know, whatever your thoughts and theories, do let me know down in the comments below. I would love to hear what people think about this mysterious new character. If you have enjoyed this video, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new for more stuff like this in the future. But otherwise, until the next one, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now.